Isn't just going to be about healthcare, just to get your appetite whetted. So first, thanks to Bob and Christian for contributing to this, and let's get going since our time is limited. So that's where we're from. This is a North American interpretation of European ideas, so you'll forgive us. So talk about resilience tends to emphasize the action of agents in complex adaptive socio-technical systems, how they anticipate or detect threats or opportunities, how they take action to forestall or facilitate them, and we already heard this phrase today, stepping into the breach, the fissure, if you will, as in the picture. So this is a very natural view of resilience, given that human actors are the most adaptable elements in any system and are always going to be the last resort when other elements are falling short. But I'm going to suggest that there might be two limitations or potentially misleading ideas that can come from this. And the first is the tendency to express critical events in the form of a heroic narrative, which when you combine it with our inability to articulate tacit knowledge, can give resilient interventions and the agents acting them a magical or mythical quality. This is Bob's idea, the divine bolt from the blue, that fails to illuminate supportive resources or the conditions that evoke them, much less providing us guidance on how to ensure the capabilities. The second is the implication that systems of work are unevolving or implacable, which by viewing people as the only malleable resource limits our notions of what is possible. And this may be true in the short time span, but it ignores the role of constraints as the shapers of action and thereby narrows the workspace for resilience engineering. So we're going to draw on Giddens' structuration theory and the body of practice theories to highlight this dynamic relationship between structure and agency and its relationship to resilient performance and argue for the value of this point to enhance our prospects. Now, historically, in understanding social work, there have been two main traditions, two main perspectives, a dualism, if you will, of structure and agency. Structural sociology emphasizes the importance of the social whole over the individual parts, which is a good thing. And the explanations tend to highlight the structural constraints. But the problem with that is, it's not necessarily a problem, but it's the limit, that it is a deductive approach and it favors something called objectivity. On the other hand, the interpretive approach argues that the study of human behavior is the study of lived experience. And interpretive sociology highlights the importance of self-reflexivity. So this is the subjective understanding of meanings, interpretations, activities, and interactions, and argues that when you're looking at actions or motivations of individuals, then it's important to understand that as opposed to the effects of the structure. So this is where Giddens steps in. And he has argued, much like my favorite philosopher, Calvin. I'll just read this for those of you at the back. You may not be able to see it. So Calvin's getting out of bed. Every day is the same old thing, but not today. He runs out not wearing any clothes. And, of course, his mother catches him. Everybody is a slave to routine. So this kind of gets to the point. So Giddens argues that the social system is reproduced. Social practice exhibits structural properties, which when we maintain them over long periods of time and space become the foundations for our institutions. Which Bella argues that we form institutions and they form us every time we engage in a conversation that matters. So this is this ongoing reproductive and productive cycle or recursive spiral that Giddens refers to. And Giddens, of course, is not the only theorist that has drawn it this way. So crucial to this notion of reality is this, like I just said, this actively and intentionally produced and reproduced this recursive relationship where neither structure nor action can exist independently. So this probably isn't new to many in the audience. And this is a central feature in this broad family, toolbox, if you will, of practice theories. There's no one unified practice theories, but there's a grand toolbox of a very rich tradition that we can draw on. So the argument that we're going to present is that this articulation of this mutually constitutive and dynamic relationship between agency and structure forces trade-offs in everyday practice. And it can foster that, or what we hope for, resilience or balance. Now, I'm going to use a biological example first off, and then we'll go to healthcare. So biology offers us this idea, the idea of stigmergy. So some of you may know this. This gives a great idea of the recursive relationship. So there's this coordination paradox in social insects, that they demonstrate complex social, behavioral, and physical manifestations like termite mounds or ants, if you will. And so Grass developed this concept to detect or denote artifact-mediated collaboration. So we know this from looking at how ants work. They go back to the nest with food. They lay down a pheromone trail. They modify the environment. Other ants come along. They notice the pheromone. They go on that trail, pick up more food. As the food items are diminished, the pheromone production stops, the trail decays, and the ants resume their apparently mindless, aimless wandering. So this concept of stigmergy has been progressively expanded beyond its relatively limited origins. This is the North American-European connection on the internet, and applies to a higher order coordination in economies and human societies. And fundamentally, stigmergy illustrates what I'm trying to say about this recursive nature of structure and action. People take actions based on an existing structure. By those actions, the structure is reinforced or modified or altered. And by those reinforcements, modifications, or alterations, future actions are influenced. Okay, now, this is the illustrative example that comes from healthcare, this generative potential for the structure-agency relationship. And it comes from the problematic of the waiting room. This is what we live with every day. So probably no surprise to anyone in the audience, time to response to the acutely ill and injured is the raison d'etre of an emergency department. But our capability is chronically challenged by limited access because previously admitted patients are boarded in the ED. We are the infinitesimally expandable space within healthcare, and often the only available space is a hallway or a waiting room in order to care for patients. So although the provision of care in a waiting room or a hallway is quite controversial, I would argue the alternative is potentially worse. And in my own department, we as a group of physicians changed our practice to mitigate risk for patients who were waiting, were unseen by attending to them wherever they were. We went out to find them, whether they were in the ambulance bay, whether in the hallway or in the waiting room. But because the waiting room was not a monitored space, our nursing colleagues felt uncomfortable coming and administering medication in a way that didn't meet their practiced or negotiated standards. And so here in this liminal space of a waiting room, the political dimension of safety played out. Nurses perceived the risk of harm as an act of commission. They did not want to administer a medication without adequate monitoring, which I can understand. While the physicians perceived the potential of patient harm as an omission by not attending to an unstable patient in a timely way. And both groups were attempting to mitigate risk within the constraints of their respective structures, i.e. the rules and resources that they had at them. So their bricolage was different. So physicians had more power to innovate, but the nurses exerted power through resistance. And then we had 5 waiting room deaths in a month. And that cluster of deaths provoked a very urgent dialogue and a collective change in practice that led to the development of these things: an overcapacity protocol, assessment zones, kind of like a pit crew, observation units, and decongestion targets where money flowed back to the department if we were more timely. And these novel structures have allowed for far more timely assessments and interventions, greater margin of maneuver, and an improvement in patient flow through the emergency department. So this, I think, exemplifies or gives us an example of where changes in formal or informal structures can have both intended and unintended consequences for work and the capacity to act, i.e. agency, and the meaning for work. And one of the fundamental take-homes, I think, is that work systems can never match their environment completely. Like all systems, there's always a gap in fitness and a need to adapt. So anything that's going to remain viable over time has to cope with the unexpected, and it must be able to revise and replace its structures. For variation, of course, contributes to progress, but also stability in a changing environment. And bureaucracy, well, it's not always our friend because it's often coercive and inflexible, i.e. brittle. It can also enable work performance because it can provide guidance and clarify responsibilities while not squashing innovation and creativity, which is where it often gets into trouble. So I've mentioned the word bricoleur or bricolage. So a bricoleur works within the possibilities of a finite system, always negotiating a trade-off between structure and performance. And the science of the bricoleur, this is Levi Strauss, is a science of the concrete because the bricoleur is obliged to work within what they have. I think this is a little different than Kluge because this is a productive adaptation. So they have to cope with the inherent resistances and constraints, i.e. the ragtag work of what they do. So these constraints and resources can channel the set of possible innovations and paths or evolutionary paths. So I would argue that resilient organizations appreciate practice variations as a potential trove for unique innovations and commit resources to developing them in order to support and enable adaptive action. And I think that's a marker of a resilient organization. So whereas variable practice is instrumental in maintaining stability amidst perturbations, stable mechanisms and limits can enable adaptability by providing a background and memory for identifying the unexpected. And effective organization helps coordinate that. Anyone know that this is a swarm or a flock? And I think that is actually maybe an illustrative model also we could probably pull on. So this duality, not dualism, duality, perspective of practice offers us an insight into how exploitation and exploration intertwine in the messy world and reflects this tension that we can't resolve but must actively manage. Now, one of the limits of Giddens' structuration theory is it leaves room still to understand practices as the activities of individuals guided by rules. And I would argue that other practice theories have gone beyond that, and they reach their potential as an innovative view of social action when you take the locus of analysis and move it from the individual to the practice. And one statement is it's practices all the way down. So you can't understand individuals alone. You can't understand structures alone. You have to understand them together as in practice. So arguing that trade-offs then from this recursive practice perspective or structuration perspective helps us to move beyond this problematic dualism of structure and agency, and it guides our understanding in interdependencies and the margin of maneuver. And I would also suggest that a recursive lens illuminates different approaches to designing resilient systems that are capable of coping with complexity in everyday practice. And I leave you this slide because I think this is a terrific, at least in my view, model of what I've just talked about. Because I think what we're doing at the end of the day is trying to balance on the line so we don't slip over that edge. And a sailing crew in a dinghy is a terrific example of balance, despite the winds, the waves, the structure, their individual actions, their coordination of actions, and maybe it's a useful metaphor for us to take. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful.